Oh, sorry. Just snacking on my favorite Inca dish. You probably thought popcorn was invented for the movies, but I've just come back from Peru, where the Inca people were popping popcorn more than 500 years ago. I'm Arizona Smith. My work as an archaeologist takes me all around the world, but one of my favorite places is South America, home of the Inca. The Inca Empire stretched more than 2,500 miles down the length of the Andes Mountains and included close to 9 million people. That's a lot of land and a lot of people for a single emperor to control, but the Inca Empire was incredibly powerful for its time. Its size and efficiency rivaled the Roman Empire at its peak. The Inca Empire extended over some of the harshest lands on Earth. Its people farmed in the Andes more than 10,000 feet high. They built cities deep within the jungle, and they lived in one of the driest deserts on the planet. They accomplished all of this with no wheel, no system of writing, and no TV. Just kidding, of course they didn't have TV. So how do we know so much about the Inca Empire? Well, for one, they may have built in some pretty out-of-the-way places, but that hasn't stopped archaeologists like me from seeking them out. In the mountainous world of the Inca, stone was sacred. Some rocky peaks like these were even thought to have special powers. Living among these craggy rocks, the Inca were inspired to become some of the greatest builders in history. This is called Ollantaytambo, a special retreat for the emperor. Many of the Inca buildings look like part of the landscape, almost as if they grew there. These may look like steps, but they are actually terraces built for farming on the steep slopes. The Inca were great engineers, too, building gutters and water channels for irrigating their fields that still work well today, 500 years later. The stoneworking skills were handed down from father to son through generations. Unlike modern-day Inca, the ancient Inca worked without iron or steel tools, without nails, even without wheels to help them haul the stones. Yet the great Inca buildings have survived earthquakes, which have toppled many built later. In constructing their buildings, the Inca didn't use mortar, but cut each stone perfectly by hand to cradle the one above it. Some of these stones are more than 20 feet high and weigh more than 100 tons. Even a knife blade won't fit between them. Hundreds of years later, visitors can still admire these great Inca buildings in cities like Cusco. But there were stories about another city, even more beautiful, hidden in the mountains. These stories captured the imagination of an American named Hiram Bingham. In 1911, Bingham set out to find the lost city of the Inca. He traveled through rough country, climbing steep mountains and pushing his way through the rainforest. 7,000 feet above sea level, he found it, the ruins of Machu Picchu. There were the remains of dozens of houses, simple shelters with one room, and larger two-story houses for nobles. One of the most impressive structures was a tower Bingham named the Temple of the Sun. The wall was perfectly curved around a large piece of rock carved to serve as an altar. Up a long stairway was another carved sacred rock. Scholars believe priests could have used it to indicate when to sow and harvest the crops by observing when the rock shadow disappeared in the spring and fall. Before Machu Picchu was abandoned mysteriously in 1532, about 1,200 people lived up here at the top of the world, farming the hillsides. People have been living in the Andes for thousands of years, probably as far back as 12,000 BC. Remember popcorn? Well, the people of the Andes have been growing corn for almost 6,000 years. The Andes were home to many different civilizations, like the Nazca and the Moche, who both lived along the coast of Peru. These civilizations developed ways of farming and created beautiful works of art, which the Inca later adopted as their own. The Inca people settled in the Cusco Valley some 800 years ago and lived there peacefully until a man named Pachacuti took the throne in 1438. He marched armies through the Andes, conquering everybody in his path, and in less than 30 years, he created an empire. He called himself Earthshaker. Before radio and television and instant news, the only way to communicate with the far reaches of an empire was the road. And like the Roman emperors before them, Inca rulers were great road builders. 15,000 miles of roads stretched through jungles, over mountains, and across rivers. Relay runners were stationed miles apart to pass the news along, which could travel as far as 250 miles in a day over the network. The royal couriers were the eyes and ears of the ruler, keeping watch over the empire. Every Inca emperor was called Sapa Inca, which means unique one. The people believed the emperor was descended from the sun, and they treated him like a god. They served his food in gold and silver dishes. Every day, they dressed him in new clothes and burned the old ones. When the Sapa Inca died, his body was mummified, sort of like the ancient Egyptians. But the Inca took it a step further. When important decisions needed to be made, they brought their mummified emperors out and asked them for advice. The Inca felt great respect, not only for the dead emperors, but for all their ancestors.
Inca priests were doctors too. They even performed brain surgery. Surgeons drilled into the skull with special tools. We can tell that surgeons were very skillful because many Incas lived long after their surgery. Inca doctors also had their own version of stitches. They bit off the heads of large ants and used the ants' jaws as clips to close the wounds. Pretty cool.
Hey, Arizona.
Hey, Steph, what's up?
I just want to show you something really cool that my aunt brought back from Peru. Isn't this beautiful?
It sure is. Looks a lot like an ancient Inca weaving. But, you know, in those days, it took so much time and effort to weave fabric that the Inca considered their finest cloth to be more valuable than gold.
Whoa, that's crazy. Who would want to spend all their time weaving this stuff?
Well, everybody in the community did some kind of craft work. Inca women made all of the family clothing, but men could also weave as they went about their daily chores. Most Inca clothing was made from wool, guess where it came from.
I know, from all those funny-looking llamas and alpacas. I'll bet their clothing was pretty soft.
You're right, but remember, only the royal family got to wear the finest clothing. You see, Inca society was organized kind of like a pyramid. The emperor, the Sapa Inca at the top, and then below him, his relatives and the noblemen, and then below that, the officials, and then all the way at the bottom, the farmers.
Sounds pretty tough on the farmers.
Well, yes and no. The land was owned all by the emperor, and everyone, and I mean everyone, did some work for the state every year, kind of like an annual tax. If you're a man, you might work on a road building project. If you're a woman, you might weave fine cloth.
What if somebody didn't feel like working?
Not very likely. You see, everybody was part of the community and working for it. Your friends would all be working. You'd be working together. Besides, the Inca state provided everyone with land to cultivate so nobody would go hungry.
Wow, that's neat.
Yeah, sure is. The land was divided into 3 parts. 1/3 of the crops went to the gods, 1/3 of the crops went to the emperor, and 1/3 went to the farmers. Look at how mountainous the land is. It was incredibly tough to farm. But the Incas were smart. They increased the amount of land they could farm by building flat strips, we call them terraces, along the mountainsides. And they dug canals to bring rainwater to the land. This system was so good that the descendants of the Incas still farm that way today.
Well, we know the Inca didn't have the wheel to help them out. But what about horses? Horses must have made life easier.
No horses. You mentioned llamas. They were strong enough to carry things with, but not strong enough to carry most people.
Well, I thought my chores at home were pretty tough, but that dishwasher's looking better all the time. Well, I'm out of here. I gotta get home to my community to do my chores. Bye.
Well, maybe the Inca had something. The Inca may have worked hard, but they also knew how to play. And for them, the biggest celebration of the year was the Inti Raymi, the festival of the sun. It's still celebrated today by the descendants of the Inca. This great festival was held every year on June 21st, at the time of the winter solstice in the southern hemisphere. The harvest was over and it was time to thank the sun for the crops, or to ask for better crops next season. The Inca had many gods, but one of the most important was the sun god, Inti. In ancient times, the Sapa Inca would lead the ritual. From a golden cup, he would drink a special beer made from corn, passing it on to others to share. Living at high altitudes has helped the Inca develop lungs which are larger and stronger than normal. They come in handy for dancing. The women still dress much as they did long ago, in a long tunic covered by a shawl, their hair in braids. In ancient times, your headdress would identify which part of the empire you came from. Even today, Highlanders can tell your village by the style of your hat.
Even though the Incas didn't have a writing system, they developed a good way to record information, like how many potatoes they had in the storeroom. See this knotted string? Each knot represents a number according to how it was tied and where it came on the string. The Incas called their counting strings quipus, which means knots in Quechua, the Inca language.
Do you guys remember how I mentioned the Nazca and Moche civilizations? These people were around long before the Inca ever arrived, and their cultures greatly influenced the Inca Empire. The Nazca are known today for their mysterious lines in the desert. I'll tell you about them later. The Moche are famous for their beautiful crafts, gold, silver, pottery, cloth, you name it. Recently, archaeologists uncovered some extraordinary Moche treasures. in a king's tomb in the desert. It may be the richest tomb ever discovered in the Western Hemisphere. But to these archaeologists and their staff, it's painstaking work as they examine every inch of the sacred site, almost 2,000 years old. To the Moche, this was a place of worship, perhaps the scene of ritual sacrifice. The clues are here, buried in layers of sand and dirt. For example, the archaeologists have found skeletons bent in odd positions, not lying straight as most Moche were buried. These could be sacrificial victims. And nearby, they uncovered the grave of someone so important, they named him the Lord of Sipan, the warrior priest. His skull was layered with gold ornaments. He was buried with more than 1,000 pieces of pottery. And he carried a golden scepter, a sign of his power. Clues like these help archaeologists piece together a picture of Moche civilization. Further down the coast of Peru are clues to other cultures which rose and fell before the Inca came to power. Two-thousand-year-old mummies, naturally dried by the desert air, lie in the sand. It's one of the driest places on Earth. Nearby, the lack of rain has also preserved giant, mysterious drawings in the desert, like a bird, a spider, or a whale. There are also lines that are miles long and straight as an arrow. About 1,500 years ago, a people called the Nazca created these mysterious lines by scraping away the rocky outer layer to reveal the lighter soil underneath. But why did they do it? Some archaeologists say the lines are part of a huge calendar or astronomical chart. Others think they point the way to water sources. And someone even wrote a book claiming the lines were runways for ancient astronauts. But for now, the Nazca lines remain a puzzle. Okay, as you can see here, Steph and I have gathered some traditional Inca foods for you to take a look at. Take it away, Steph.
Well, my research has dug up some pretty interesting things. For one, the Inca enjoyed many of the same foods that we eat today, like peppers, avocados, squash, beans, and over 200 different types of potato. Corn was especially important. It could be boiled, roasted, toasted, or made into a refreshing corn drink. The most typical meal was a soup or stew made from vegetables and hot spices. Quinoa, a type of grain, was used to thicken the soup.
You know, if you visited Peru today or some of the other areas where the Inca ruled, you can still see some of the very same foods they ate hundreds of years ago. The markets even are similar to the Inca markets of long ago, except that the Inca didn't have money. They exchanged things instead.
The Inca often kept guinea pigs in their houses, but just like we raise pigs and chickens, they were raising the guinea pigs to eat. Do you think it tastes good? Guinea pig meat may have been the only meat the peasants ever ate. The Inca in Peru still eat guinea pigs today.
Hey, what's going on? I thought you were pulling together facts on life as an Inca kid. Do you have a track meet or something?
Nope, just preparing for the most important ceremony of my entire life.
What do you mean?
Well, see, if I were an Inca kid, when I turned 14, I have to endure a test of strength and courage. Once I passed, I have to swear an oath of loyalty. Then I'd get a sling, a shield, and a mace.
That's all you'd get for all that work?
Oh yeah, I'd also get a loincloth too. Guess before that, I'll just be running around naked.
Well, when I turned 14, I'd also get a special ceremony. But no pumping iron for me. I'd have to fast for 3 days. And then I'd be bathed and washed and my long, beautiful hair would be combed and braided. And then I'd get a new robe and a big feast.
But once I passed my test of strength, my ears would be pierced, and I'd become a warrior. Then I'd get a cool new name like Puma, or Hawk, or Dragon.
Me too. But only my name would be something like Pure or Star or Gold. And then I got married.
Well, if you were really beautiful, then you could be taken away from your family even earlier, like at age 10.
I know. I read about that stuff too. I'd be called a chosen woman and be taught religion, how to weave beautiful clothes, and make food for special festivals.
Yup, while I was out farming or battling some great battles, you'd be weaving away.
Yeah, but if I were really, really beautiful, I might have to marry the emperor or one of the royal family. You know, I think I'd rather look like me and stay in my village.
Yeah, I guess I'd rather be me too. But it sure would be cool to have a name like Puma or Hawk.
To the Incas, gold was sacred. One of their chief gods was the sun, so they called gold sweat of the sun. Silver was called tears of the moon. The Incas made many beautiful objects of gold and silver, but most of them have disappeared. They were melted down by the Spanish so they could take the precious metals home.
So what happened to the Inca? This great empire rose and fell in only 100 years. In 1533, a Spaniard by the name of Francisco Pizarro arrived in Cusco looking for gold and treasure. He had less than 200 men with him, but his timing was great. 2 Inca emperors, Atahualpa and Huáscar, were battling for power over the empire. Worse yet, the Spaniards brought new diseases like smallpox to South America. And the Incas were dying by the thousands. The entire country was at war, divided and weak. The Inca didn't know what to make of the Spanish. They dressed in metal suits, had hair growing from their chins, and rode mysterious animals. The Inca had never even seen a horse before the Spanish arrived. Atahualpa was curious about these newcomers and invited them to his palace. The Inca expected a peaceful meeting, but Pizarro had prepared an ambush. In a matter of hours, it was over. With their horses and guns, the Spaniards quickly defeated the Inca and captured Atahualpa. Though the Inca fought on, their empire was soon conquered. The Spanish destroyed Inca temples and palaces, melted down their gold and silver, and prevented the Inca from practicing their traditional way of life. But today, descendants of the Inca live on the very same lands as their ancestors, and they continue to practice traditions handed down from a time when the great Inca emperors ruled over an empire the length of South America.